All right. Well, while we are getting mic'd up, let me introduce my colleagues here. I'm Mark Stencil. EJ just kindly introduced me. EJ described himself as a former ink-stained wretch. I guess that's.
I still am one.
Well, that's right. I'm more of a pixel-stained wretch, but I now tell my students I am a fake professor of real news at Duke University. I'm really thrilled to have my colleagues up here with me today. Let me introduce them. I'll introduce them from your left to right. Hopefully I've gotten that right, or we already start out with misinformation. But John Bullock here from Northwestern University. He is our official partisanship expert in this group, and we appreciate that from Northwestern. We've got Matt Jordan from Penn State, who is our media studies expert, and then we have Lori Robertson from factcheck.org, managing editor there, to be our fact expert. So we've got the perfect combination of people to talk about the persistence of misinformation. Now, the structure of these panels today, each of our panelists is going to give us a few minutes of thoughts on the question at hand. I'll respond a little bit, and then we'll move off into questions and answers, so just so you understand how we're doing this. So let's start with you, John, if you don't mind.
No, not a bit. So my work focuses less on the production of misinformation than on the prevalence of false beliefs, and especially partisan differences between factual beliefs. Partisan differences with respect to factual beliefs between Republicans and Democrats. You've probably heard about some of these differences before, like a 2010 finding, for example, that nearly half of Republicans believed that Obama had a secret plan to turn the United States over to a one-world government. Or more recently, the finding that only a third of Americans would reject outright the idea that Hillary Clinton was involved in a secret child sex ring. In no sense do I mean to deny that beliefs like these may be important, but they're getting the lion's share of attention, and there's a very different class of belief that we can also be very confident is important. I'm speaking of bread and butter beliefs about the condition of the US national economy and the state of US wars. It's these two conditions, the economy and war, that most often seem to have large effects on our presidential elections. We do sometimes see partisan differences even with respect to these beliefs. So for example, you remember in 1988, Democrats were just much more likely than Republicans to say that inflation had gone up during the Reagan administration. 12 years later, it was the reverse. Republicans were more likely than Democrats to say that the deficit had gone up under Clinton. Now, Mark, by my reading, in both journalism and academia, survey findings like this are more or less taken at face value. That is, they're taken as uncomplicated indications of what people really believe. And the thrust of my research is that we shouldn't do that. At least where there are survey findings that have some sort of partisan bent to them, well, these survey findings are not often good indications of what people really believe. And one reason is simply that partisans will sometimes say things in surveys to make one party look good or another bad, even if they don't believe it. Now, I just want to draw out, I see 4 points emerging from the current research that I want to mention just to make this idea more specific. So first, suppose that, like many in political science, you just want to take surveys at face value. Even then, it turns out that partisan differences in factual beliefs, at least about the economy and war, they're not as great as we might imagine. The most comprehensive study that I know looks at the American National Election Studies from 1988 through 2008. Every factual question it's asked about the economy or inequality. And it turns out that the median difference in answers between Republicans and Democrats on these topics is 12 percentage points. In other words, if you compute the percentage of Republicans answering correctly, percentage of Democrats answering correctly, and you take the difference between those two percentages, well, the median difference is only 12 percentage points. It's not nothing, but it doesn't justify a claim like Democrats and Republicans are living in separate realities, at least so far as national economic conditions are concerned. Second point, so that first point applies if you want to take surveys at face value. But the second point is that you should not be taking surveys at face value, at least where very partisan matters are concerned. And as I've suggested, the reason is that, well, there are two reasons. One is that there are partisans, Democrats and Republicans, who know the right answers to our survey questions, but they give the wrong ones. And they're doing this, not all of them, but some of them, to make their own party look good or the other party look bad. On top of that, there are many people who simply don't know the answers to factual questions about politics, like has unemployment been going up or down? And many of these people, too, instead of saying, I don't know, will give a partisan answer. Now, that may sound like bad news, but I'm presenting it to you as good news. What it means is that we are perhaps overstating the prevalence of false beliefs when we take surveys at face value, and we're almost certainly overstating the extent to which Democrats and Republicans are polarized with respect to their beliefs. Third point, the last of these upbeat points. I fear that I'm going to be closing on a rather dour note. This is the last optimistic point. We all know that, first of all, that many people don't know the answers to factual questions about politics. And we also know that they won't always tell us that they don't know. People will often give a substantive answer, even when they really don't know. What's less well appreciated is this. Just a little probing will show you that these people who don't know the answer, they very often know that they don't know the answer. In other words, they're not deluded about their own state of knowledge. And I take that to be a pretty good sign, too. It's all else equal. It's good that people who don't know the answers are aware that they don't know the answers. All right, that's it for the good news.
Now the bad news.
Yeah, so the bad news, which does reflect my more general feelings on the matter, is this. So the thrust of my comments has been that in certain respects, we might be making a mistake to take surveys at face value. But if I'm right, what this implies is that we may have the wrong understanding of the connection between people's factual beliefs and their votes. We claim to have a lot of evidence that there's a strong connection between people's factual beliefs and their votes. So implicitly or explicitly, in our models of presidential elections, for example, beliefs about the economy and war, they seem to have a big influence on how we vote. But much of our data on this point comes from surveys. And as I've suggested, those surveys may not be good indications of people's actual beliefs. And it turns out that when you use different methods to elicit people's actual beliefs, the strength of the association between people's factual beliefs and their votes, it's cut in half. It's still substantial, but it's not nearly as strong as we used to think. So, in other words, we may be overstating the prevalence of false beliefs. We're almost certainly overstating the extent to which Democrats and Republicans differ on matters of fact. But Democrats and Republicans alike, their votes seem to be less influenced by these factual beliefs than we thought, probably less influenced by factual beliefs than we would really like.
So quick question on this before we move on. How does media consumption patterns affect this intersection of belief and partisanship?
Well, we used to think that, in fact, there was very little relation because our line for a very long time, at least in political science, was that there was very little selective exposure to politics. So it was not true, for example, it didn't used to be true. Even in the late 1990s, when Fox News already existed, it didn't used to be true that partisans were selecting particular media and avoiding other kinds of media. Some were, to be sure. Most were not. But increasingly, I fear that that's the case. And to the extent that that increases, we're going to see more of a role for false beliefs than we've seen before. In other words, I have upbeat points, but I don't take the trends to be in the right direction.
All right, wrong track. All right, Matt.
So I'm going to tell a quick story here about the development of media over time as it pertains to misinformation. So what I want to say is that as media has grown as a way of transmitting information across time and space, it's gathered communities together around this, but it's also afforded, with the affordances of each of these media steps, the potential for spreading misinformation. So we could go back to the printing press to see this. So the printing press has long been associated with the spread of rationality, astronomical tables, mathematical charts, geometry, things like this. But it was also true that some of the biggest selling genres at the early onset of print were mystical texts, hermetic texts, the stuff that gives us the Illuminati today. Because this stuff sold, because people were interested in this secret world out there beyond the facts, as you might say. And we see this as we move into the Counter-Reformation. The word propaganda itself comes from the propagation of faith, right? And so you have these communities that are based on using whatever means available to zealously promote their views. This was what bothered, as EJ mentioned, this is what bothered the Founding Fathers as we kind of reached the Age of Enlightenment, that we had partisan media, largely newspapers used to be political organs, and Thomas Jefferson felt they were all bad, but knew that the only antidote to it was a pluralistic media environment where people could kind of all get their perspectives in, so hence the freedom of the press. So about the time that Thomas Jefferson was writing in America, Hegel in Germany argued that the newspaper had replaced the prayer book, again, one of the biggest selling genres of literature up until that point, as the daily prayer. So then the modern secular state, the imagined community, was formed around the consumption of news. And so what interests me about this is the way in which you start to see a ritual consumption of news and information as part of how people organize their daily lives. And that, in a way, also has, as is affordance, a kind of a blank slate approach. We tend to believe what we read and then check it later. So the immediate thing is to see what's in the newspaper, take it in, and then we deal with things after that. So as the 19th century progresses, you see technologies that increase the speed of production and the space of transmission for media, things like the linotype, the steam press, that we see changes in models of news away from subscription toward daily sales. And what this means is that all of these affordances that the technology allows for are starting to be used to drive sales, starting to be used to do this. And so we start to see the rise of sensationalism in journalism. I've been researching the origin of the term fake news that has now become the moniker, and it turns out that fake news was something that progressives and socialists and muckrakers started using at the end of the 19th century because they were so concerned about the way in which a owned press, a press that was increasingly monopolized by big companies, and was being used to misinform. Now, some of the misinformation that they pointed out was of the garden variety. Priest walks on water, right? Because everybody loves to, or is man eaten by locusts. Like, these were the stories that because of the telegraphic wire now could be spread and sold as commodities. And because everything was about driving circulations, people had incentives to pick these stories up because they were, run-of-the-mill variety. But there were also concerned that these bits of misinformation were also, you would start to see things like commission, problems where there were outright lies about, say, labor strikes, but also sins of omission, where the media frames were used by the people who controlled the newspaper to suppress news. And that, in a way, is also a kind of misinformation, because as the progressives like Upton Sinclair argued, without a vibrant press, we don't even know what's going on, so we can't fix our problems. So the term fake news then was picked up as a way to kind of critique people like William Randolph Hearst, who was driving a kind of increasingly larger wire service that was based on profiting off of people's interest in outlandish stories, sensational stories, stories of explosions, stories of melodrama. And these are all things that we see a little bit of in our media environment today. Another form of media that emerges is the radio, right? And we see in the beginning of the radio, take the case of the Titanic, right? The Titanic was saved by the radio, or in a way, they used the wireless telegraph to get the California to come save them. But also at the very same time, there were fake radio reports about the Titanic being saved that went out by individuals who were transmitting stuff. So again, we see this ambivalent relationship to the technological tool, that it allows for both good things and also for the spread of misinformation. Television we could think about as well. Think back to the movie Network, right? Sidney Pollack's increasingly prescient view of the media environment. So that around the 1970s, you start to see the erosion of the firewall between news divisions and programming, where what had once been a quid pro quo, we give you a license to promote, to make money off of this monopoly that we grant you as a license, and as a public service, you do news. Early 70s, this starts to erode, and there's increasingly a desire for profitable news. And what Network talks about is how opinion which is a stripped-down version of investigative reporting. We all know investigative reporting is expensive. Sometimes you don't come up with anything. They figured out in the 1970s that if you just opined on the news, told people how to think on the news, modeled an effective relationship to the news, that was what got people to tune in. So the I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore moment in Sidney Pollack's network, this is about articulating the popular rage, right? And that's what Pollack worried about were tuning in for. So we see, again, the affordances of media, the television, which people at the time thought would bring people together toward a kind of more vibrant democracy, being used to create these communities around information and increasingly around affect. And I think this is that affective relationship of outrage and resentment is one to think about. Adam Smith once wrote that we're not so interested in having our friends having people we know take on our friendship as we are in having them take in our resentments. And in a way, what we see today is a kind of a flourishing of that idea, where the communities that we're increasingly moving toward are communities of anger, communities of feeling. So in the current media environment, and I could talk a little bit about radio, because I think that also it leads to some of the problems that we have. Radio was, again, a huge media that drew communities together across huge, vast spaces. And they heard things at the same time. But by the 1980s, the most profitable mode of radio was talk radio, right? Again, these communities of affect, where what you see are people increasingly figuring out that what got people to tune in every day was the question, what's he going to say next? So Limbaugh, Imus, Stern, they would just say outlandish things, and people would say, oh my God, what's he going to say next? And in a way, those are the heirs of the Trumps and the Alex Jones of the world. So in our convergent media environment today, where we see digital using stuff from print, we see using stuff from radio, using stuff from television, you see this, but it's now compounded by algorithms, by the digital platform. Because what the digital platform does is it allows you to self-select your community of outrage, your community of resentment, and filter everything out. And not only that, but it does it for you. So again, in the world of the digital platform, the customer is always right, and the customer is consuming the news, and what they're essentially doing is a feedback loop of belief, right? So we tune in, we get our beliefs confirmed, and that makes us feel good. But increasingly, what used to be, if you go back to my Hegel quote, right, that the national media was the daily prayer, what we now see is balkanizing niche media being done, right? Steve Bannon was a Goldman Sachs guy who's investing in niche media, targeting people because we know their digital profiles and feeding them exactly what they want to hear to confirm the beliefs that they already have. This is what you start to see in niche media. And again, what it does, if you go back to the sins of commission, is it suppresses all that other stuff. The things that you click on is what's going to pop up on your Google search. And Google knows that that's what drives their revenue, getting you to click, getting you to do that. So sensationalism, we've known since forever that this drives sales. And all this is compounded now through the technologies that afford it. So this is, I think, the big challenge for misinformation, is how to cultivate a taste for something like pluralism, something like a media environment that is not just about what you want to hear. And I think that's the challenge we have today.
So a quick question about that. I feel like the research on the filter bubble echo chamber effect has been sort of a little back and forth on that. And what do you make of the other side of the argument, that the fact that all of us complain about our people being in filter bubbles, and yet we still hear Uncle Bob's crazy theories on Facebook, and so that suggests that the filter bubbles are being broken in some ways.
Well,
or is it all about who believes which information from which sources?
Well, that's partly it, but I think that in information theory, for instance, people who study games, right? They know that, and what Facebook, they're a surveillance company who trades, well, Yes, who trades essentially our digital profile. They develop every time we like, or now we have little emoticons about whether we kind of liked it, whether it makes our face do this or that. Those are very sophisticated tools for developing personality profiles for us. But what they need is engagement. So my theory on the crazy uncle is in game theory, they realize that there has to be a little bit of noise in the game to keep people coming back, right? If it's too much redundancy, it's not engaging. But if the crazy uncle is there, then it feels like community. So my guess is these are all being driven by data points that suggest that what creates more engagement, which is what Facebook and Google want, is in fact the crazy uncle popping up every once in a while to say outlandish things.
So it's simulated community. Okay. Lori, fact checking will save us, right?
Oh, yeah. We got it. Well, I was actually going to start with some good news on the status of facts, the topic of our panel. Facts matter. It's okay. And there's a real hunger for facts. And it's been interesting that there's always been concern about misinformation and disinformation. We don't distinguish between the two, or falsehoods and misleading information. But I think we've definitely seen more concern since the 2016 election and the growth of false news spread through Facebook and other means. But while that's gone on, we've also seen evidence that people are very interested in the facts. The number of visits to our website hit records in the 2016 election. We typically see a big drop-off after a presidential year, but we didn't see as much of a drop-off. In 2017, the unique page visits to our site were about double what they were in 2013, which would have been the last post-presidential off-election year. And people are also spending more time on our page in 2017 on average than they were in 2016. So we think that's a good sign. Just to give some numbers, in 2016, the average time spent on a single page on our site was 34 seconds. We had a lot of traffic in 2016, but people weren't spending that much time on average. Average time per page in 2017 was 2 minutes and 16 seconds. So that's substantial, right? I think that's a good sign. And these signs are not unique. The signs that facts matter aren't unique to factcheck.org. CNBC recently did a story on increases in ratings and readership of major media outlets. The Post, Washington Post last year said its digital-only subscriptions had more than doubled in 2017. I think these are good signs. People aren't reading the Washington Post and the New York Times and watching CNN and coming to our website, factcheck.org, unless they care about the facts, right? So then there's bad news, and the bad news is, we find ourselves debunking the same false and misleading claims again and again. We, as fact checkers, often live in Groundhog Day, which was a great movie, but so much so that we launched a feature during the 2016 campaign that we called Groundhog Friday. It ran on Friday, and it was a wrap-up of claims that politicians had repeated that we had already written about, maybe multiple times. And this is the challenge, certainly, for fact checkers. Politicians or viral claims will repeat themselves again and again. And I think that, and perhaps my panelists could comment on this later, but I think that repetition does help spread and instill those beliefs or those claims. And, we can only write a story so many times before it starts to be ridiculous having the same story on our website. So Groundhog Friday was one way where we tried to, repeat our fact check in not a, completely annoying way. But it's not just politicians that are repeating the claims. We see readers asking us about the same claims again and again as well. And some of those questions, some people I think are asking us to debunk viral claims that their crazy uncle sent them or somebody sent them and they just want us to write about it so they can send the uncle the link to our story. I know that happens. You can tell by what people write in their emails to us. But others are legitimately wondering, could this be true? And some of those claims that we see again and again really tap into common beliefs or common myths. And as an example, Back in 2007, readers were asking us if senators got their full pay upon retiring and didn't pay anything into Social Security, didn't pay any Social Security taxes. It's not true. We wrote a story about that, and at the time, Snopes.com, if you're not familiar, is a website that debunks viral claims and has been doing so for a long time. They wrote that email had been going around since at least 2007. So 7 years later, we wrote about it. And then 8 years later, in 2015, people were still asking us about it. So we wrote the story again. And that example is very bipartisan, which is kind of nice. It taps into this commonly held belief that members of Congress get, outrageous perks associated with their jobs. And it's a matter of opinion whether they get too many perks or not, but there are false claims out there about what they actually get. So, all of that for us, it's very hard for us to measure our impact. And we don't even really try to do that too much because we're busy. We're fact checking, we're writing the stories. And I think that's true for a lot of journalists. We're doing our jobs day to day. But it does raise some questions about, are we successful at debunking some of these commonly held beliefs that are wrong? Are we successful for some people? Do people just forget? Or are some things so strongly held that we just really have our work cut out for us?
I wonder if I'm heartened by your traffic increases, the subscription numbers for the Post and the New York Times, and but it always makes me think there's one of my favorite political stories. I have no idea if it's true. If it's not, don't tell me because it's one of my favorites. Is that a campaign rally in 1956, and someone shouts out to Adlai Stevenson, "Every thinking person is going to vote for you," and he says, "Yes, madam, but that's not enough. We need a majority." And I wonder if fact-checking work, which is stuff we work on a lot at Duke, of course, is in its own sort of filter bubble, that it is only reaching a certain audience, and what you all are thinking at factcheck.org about how to break beyond the audience that you've built to reach other kinds of audiences.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that one thing we've talked about, readers, not all readers, but some readers tend to gravitate toward the article that's negative, or that's criticizing or saying something that a politician that they don't like said was wrong. I didn't say that very well, but you don't like Hillary Clinton. She said something wrong. Oh, you really read this story. Well, did you read other ones? So, a couple things that we've tried to do, thinking about that, we occasionally do stories, and I wish we had more time for it, called the facts on, or the facts about, fill in the blank. We've done some on immigration or the Republican healthcare bills, and we weren't fact-checking a claim. We were doing, often in sort of a Q&A type format, just giving the facts on something. And it's an open question then, does that attract people from, very divergent political viewpoints? I hope so. That's one of the methods that we've employed to try to reach out.
Great. And by way of my own reaction to that, my focus has been very much on the changing media information ecosystem and its effect on the persistence of misinformation, disinformation, and the role that requires journalists to take of being guides rather than gatekeepers. And I think that this may be jumping a little ahead to our third panel today on the solutions to some of these problems, but it's enough of a concern that my friend Eric McDicken and I are writing a survival guide for media consumers because the landscape has become so confusing and confounding to most people who even want information but have a hard time figuring out what sources to rely on, what to navigate, what to trust. the work and research we've been doing at Duke has mainly been focused on the use of technology to help fact checkers like Lori at factcheck.org and the Post and at PolitiFact and other fact checking organizations across the United States and around the world to both accelerate the reporting process for fact checking, because as Lori will attest, there are not enough Loris in the world. Fact checking is a time consuming kind of reporting. It can take a day, if not weeks sometimes, to fact check certain claims. And so we want to accelerate that process with technology and also use technology to help increase the reach and impact of fact-checking, particularly to audiences that may not be getting that kind of information now. And it's sort of reverse engineering the technology you described, Matt, that has sort of allowed for a persistence of misinformation and sort of flipping that around to try to use the same tools to reach other audiences with fact-checking journalism. So, but I don't know that from what you all have said that just corrections are enough to overcome this persistence. And so where are your, again, not to jump way too further down the agenda here, but where are you looking for signs of hope that we can sort of help audiences reconcile facts and beliefs and actions, or is that just impossible and we're fighting against human nature?
It may not be impossible. I'm not saying that it's possible. I suppose one area to which I look is the effects of fact-checking, not on ordinary citizens, ordinary readers of journalism, but on politicians themselves. So there's limited evidence, but evidence which suggests that, in fact, fact-checking does affect the views of politicians, such that if they know they're being checked, they're more cautious in their statements. That's the kind of thing that makes me optimistic.
That's great.
Well, I like this metaphor because it works for everything, but you know the movie Fight Club, and one of the rules of Fight Club is you never talk about Fight Club. I think what we see is a kind of a misinformation war Fight Club going on out there, and that the media outlets are playing this misinformation game because it's good for ratings. Why else would you have Kellyanne Conway on TV, right? She's going to lie every time you put her on there. You give her a platform to do that. You know exactly what she's going to do, right? So what the CNN, who's been taking a lot of heat for this lately, has been saying, well, we just put it out there for the viewers to decide. That's been the traditional kind of post hoc kind of abdication of responsibility, in my opinion, on this. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is that journalism needs to reclaim its dedication to principles of justice, truth, equality, and make those more important than notions of journalistic objectivity based on falsification, post hoc falsification. Because once the phrase gets out there, once the media frame gets out there, once the falsehood gets out there, it takes on a life of its own, as you know. So I think it's up to journalists and media outlets to start being more responsible. And you can make this into a great spectacle, right? 3 strikes, you're out, you never get invited back. It need not be, dull, but I really think it's going to require a new approach to producing content.
And one of the other things we've tried to do is educate our readers, particularly with what we used to call fake news. And now we need to come up with new terms, but the completely made up websites that look like legitimate news organizations but aren't. And I feel for our readers because there are so many of them, and there are also new legitimate news organizations that maybe they haven't heard from, so they see these names of websites and don't always know what's real and what's not. But we've said that the readers and the news consumers are really the first line of defense here. So take the time to read something before you share it and repost it. And a lot of the made up stuff, a lot of it, so many times we'll say, that's actually a satirical website. And if you went to their About Us page, they'd flat out tell you, we make stuff up because we think this is funny, But a lot of people don't go to that About Us page. So I think some of the spread could, maybe it's optimistic to think, but it could be controlled by the news consumers themselves.
I mean, factcheck.org has been around for a long time by fact checking since 2003.
Yes,
And
2003.
and so you've had different flavors of government control and politics. Do you see, does party control in Washington or anywhere else politically affect the kinds of messages you hear, the kinds of facts that you end up checking? Does it affect who's lying or who's perceived as lying? How do partisan shifts affect our understanding of this? Because so much of the research on this has been in recent years, and so I'm sort of interested in how it looks over time.
Yeah. Well, I think we do see the same types of claims. We definitely see the same types of ways to make false and misleading claims from politicians across parties. A couple examples. We've called them before like patterns of deception. So a politician might want to make a point and use a statistic that's 5 years old instead of using the most recent one because that old statistic makes the point better. That's how, Democrats and Republicans both do that kind of thing. We look for qualifiers like, it's the most or the highest or the least, and those are often misleading. So I think, I don't think one party has a stranglehold on those things. It's a very common, behavior really that we see across parties.
Is it, from a media studies or political science point of view, are there obvious factors in the way partisanship or even particular partisanship affects our dealings with reality and facts? Are there demographic differences, ideological differences?
Go ahead.
Sure. So, not that I'm the most expert person, I think, even on the panel on this point, but age, for example, is a factor. People are more likely, I gather, to share misinformation if they're older, all else equal. The most obvious way for partisanship to enter into this question would be if partisanship really is causing people not just to expose themselves to partisan media of their own stripe, but also to not expose themselves to mixed media or media of the other ideological stripe. To the extent that that's happening, it makes it, I believe, easier for politicians to misinform because they don't have to worry about damage to their reputation.
Machiavelli once, in a letter to a prince, argued that it's sometimes necessary to deceive, but if you get caught, essentially you have to have excuses ready. And if you think about the feedback loop with partisan media, that's a lot of what happens. Is that if somebody leaves the media bubble and sees the world that doesn't conform to the belief community that they're into, you need a fix. You need a kind of booster shot of your media to alleviate the anxiety that's created by leaving that media bubble. And I think that's what you're seeing, why Fox News is so desperate these days, why it's so shrill and hammering through repetition the misinformation, is that people that are in that media bubble, when they leave it, need immediately to alleviate the anxiety that's produced by leaving it, which has a commercial benefit for serialized media, right? It's people tune in for their fix.
The excuse chapter of Machiavelli may need some editing, just given. All right, we should turn some of this over to you all. We'd love to hear questions. A reminder that we're playing Jeopardy rules here. All statements should be made in the form of a question. And we'll see what our panelists have to say. Right in the middle here on the center aisle. And somebody's going to bring you a microphone as well so everybody can hear.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a lovely panel. My question is for Lori, and I was wondering if you know what's driving this increase in people visiting factcheck.org, and if you can tell if it's that you've been linked more in news stories as a reliable news source, or if people are generically going to it, or if they're coming from Google search results, and if maybe one of those is driving more of this increase in interest in fact.
Okay, thanks. Unfortunately, I don't have a breakdown with me. I know we do get a lot from Google searches. That's very valuable to us. But like I said, right now we're in this trend with other news organizations of seeing an increase in readership. Clearly the Trump administration had something to do with that as well. There's a lot of news in general. I haven't gone back to see to look at our output, but I know we're working more. There's a lot more issues to cover. So we're probably putting a lot more content out there as well than we were in, say, the last off-election year. I have to go double-check that, but it certainly feels that way. So I think those are some of the factors, and then it's not even included in the statistics that I have access to on our site. We have some partners or friends, we call them, for other media outlets. We're a nonprofit, so our content is free. So USA Today republishes a lot of our stuff, MSN, and so we get, and we don't have access to their numbers, but we know it's millions more are seeing our stuff through those outlets as well.
In the very back row, there was someone with a question.
Rafael Sakov, Voice of America. My question is to all panelists about the story from this week, which became one of the greatest examples of misinformation. About, maybe you've heard, I think everyone has heard about Arkady Babchenko, Russian journalist, reportedly killed in Ukraine on Tuesday, but on Wednesday, next day, Ukrainian Secret Service said that it was a special operation, but everyone in the world, all media, everyone published because there were statements from police, from local government. What do you think about this type? What type of misinformation it was? Thank you.
Anyway.
I would tend to say that was an extraordinary kind of misinformation. In all seriousness, my focus, like the focus I believe of most of all of our panelists, is on American misinformation, American politics, and misinformation in the United States. I suspect that the kind of events that you've just described, about which I have read a little, are rare in the United States. And I suppose if I want to make a bigger point about it, it's that, if nothing else, we should be grateful for that.
Lori and I are both actively involved with the International Fact-Checking Network, which is sort of the consortium of fact-checking organizations like factcheck.org, but around the world, of which there are many at this point. I'm curious, like you said, most of us are focused on American politics and misinformation, disinformation, but in your reading of the research, are there different patterns to how things play out in different parts of the world, or is it really the same game everywhere? I don't know if any of you have insights on that.
I read an article back during the campaign that was looking at at Russian cyber ops misinformation as a tactic of war, and it was just talking about how clouding the field is one way to kind of confuse and kind of take away the people's capacity to get together and decide on and talk about things. And I imagine that this is an example of that, just putting out things so that nobody knows quite what to believe.
Soviet-era misinformation tactics applied to modern context. Actually, up here in the front, EJ, I think, wanted to make a point on this particular story. So,
I wanted to go somewhere completely different. First of all, thank you all. You were great. And Lori, I figure that some days an academic is going to write a paper on the correlation between total number of lies in the public sphere and your audience, because I think that's two quick questions. Question one, on the partisan perception, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been my impression that there has been a real shift in the last decade or so on the relationship between partisanship and people's comments on the economy. A real lack of fit between their own circumstances and how they judge the economy differently. And you saw that after Trump's election, where for a lot of Republicans, we suddenly had the biggest 2-week economic boom in history. And for Democrats, we had the quickest 2-week economic recession in history. I'm just curious if you've noticed a sharp increase, particularly on the economic judgments, because at least that's what I have noticed in the polls, so I haven't studied it systematically. The second is a question I always like to ask because I've never fully understood the answer to this question, which is why is it that conservative radio took off in a way that liberal radio never did? And it's not entirely true in television, for example, where eventually when MSNBC went more liberal, it actually discovered there was an audience there. It never worked for radio. And, you know, I can't believe it's simply Rush Limbaugh's genius in creating this form, which he deserves, I'll say, credit for. So those are my two questions. And again, thank you all very much for being here.
Yeah. EJ, let me take on the first question about partisan differences in perceptions of the economy. So the short answer is I don't know whether, in fact, more recently, partisans have become more divided in the sense that some event, some sudden change, like Trump's election, causes people all of a sudden to say that or perhaps really to reevaluate the economy. What I do know, and it may well be that that is what is happening, but what I do know is that this sort of thing has been happening to a substantial extent for a while. For example, when Romney ran against Obama late in the campaign, there was a very good economic report. All else equal, you might think that this was making Obama look good. Republicans became more likely after the fact, after that report was released, to say that the economy was doing poorly. And it was not an insubstantial difference. So whether these differences are growing, they may be growing, but they've been around for a while. There's even evidence back from the Nixon administration of this sort of thing happening. The other thing that I would say is this. If you ask important but very narrowly tailored questions about the economy, like, has inflation been going up in the last 8 years, the last 4 years? In fact, answers to those questions are better than they used to be, both in the sense that people are more accurate than they used to be, and in the sense that the parties are less divided than they used to be. I mean, the all-time greatest difference between the parties on that particular question, if memory serves, was 1988. Which you might think signals just the much lower salience of inflation as an issue relative to the way it used to be in the 70s and even in the 80s. But it's at least a small note of optimism that we have seen high watermarks for false responses or inaccurate responses to certain kinds of tailored economic questions.
I'll take the radio for a try. I think it's not true that if we call it NPR actually has huge audiences.
But that's not partisan media.
Right.
Sorry, that's not partisan media.
You're right. But what I would say is that's where let's just say that, like, if you think about the Oliver Stone's movie Talk Radio, right? It's based on this shock jock Alec Berg in Denver who was killed, and I mean that does a good job of describing the intimate outraged generation amongst the audience, right? There's something about the moment that came on in the 1980s, people were starting to feel dispossessed, and shock jock radio appealed to a kind of notion of personal freedom that pushed back against kind of vague forms of authority that were keeping the working man down. And so the shock jock is about the guy who straight talks, who says what's true. And part of the enjoyment that people get out of that is having somebody who's willing to say anything. I would like to say that the liberals haven't done that because that's not part of that political identity marker as much. So it just that format has appealed not so much to a partisan audience, but to a certain personality type that may be predisposed toward that type of identity politics.
Does that suggest that a certain personality type leans right then?
Well, Trump.
Just following your logic.
Trump is Trump is a shock jock. He learned his trade from Howard Stern, right? Say the outrageous thing. He's the guy who can't be held back, right? I think the appeal that he has to people is more based on that charisma as a personality type than it is on his politics, is what I would say.
I do think, and I'll say this as a former NPR person, public radio is news and information. It's not talk radio. It is not liberal radio. And actually, the audience was a lot more ideologically diverse than is generally understood. Also, a much bigger audience than most media business coverage ever sort of really picks up on. I mean, millions and millions of people a day. But I think some of the appeal of talk radio as a daytime audience in particular, where a lot of the conservative talk radio has taken hold, may have as much to do with sort of daytime listening demographics as well, and people looking for alternatives to traditional media coverage and particularly in those day parts. And so,
Can I go back to the
Yeah,
first part
please.
just quickly? So, yeah, I mean, as fact checkers, we certainly think it's interesting that Trump is saying, oh, the economy's doing so well and nobody ever thought this would happen. And when you look at the numbers, well, it's a continuation of the growth that we saw before he was elected. But that's not unusual, not just for economic issues, but we've seen it in the past with education, where the candidate wanting to get into power, and particularly when it's a change of party, saying, oh, our state of education is terrible, and finding statistics that support that. And then once they get elected, oh, the education's doing great, and here's some statistics on that. So it's a framing issue that we certainly see.
Lori, with as much inbound as you all have to contend with every day, has the way that you choose what to check changed? Or is the mix of subjects that you focus on shifting? Are you trying to counter-program to the nature of lies or what other people are fact-checking?
I don't, not really, no. I mean, we're still going through speeches and other events. Well, I think one thing that has definitely changed over the years is we used to be very ad-focused, but this is more, not so much what we do, but more of a nature of the media landscape. We used to really do TV ads. That was the main form of political communication, and now we do much less. We'll start to do more during the midterms, but we do much more tweets and Facebook posts and, speeches and other forms of communication.
We have time for a few more questions. Gentleman right up front here.
Thank you. To Lori's concept of framing an issue, I have a question is, much of what you're talking about is in the political spectrum, candidates, et cetera, during campaigns, et cetera. To what extent, once there is an election, do these lies then become vetted to the point where when you have to implement policies based on blatant lies, is there something about the process, whether it's lobbying on Congress or filing papers within various regulatory agencies, is there something we can look to in our process that purifies or sanitizes or sterilizes or some way modifies the lies in the actual governance process?
Well, we rely on government agencies a lot for statistics and information, and if you look at the economic numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or wonderful sources of information are Congressional Research Service reports, Congressional Budget Office, Joint Committee on Taxation. Those are all nonpartisan organizations that they're giving projections from JCT and the CBO, but otherwise, giving a summary of the facts and what we know. I don't know if there's...
to show that's working?
These guys are the ones to ask.
Well, I mean, if you look just look at the way that the Environmental Protection Agency, the CBO, have been attacked so viciously. So I think there are these purifying elements already there, which are professionals who work on this stuff for a living. And what's right now is being done is eroding confidence in those institutions that used to check us from the lies. And I think that's probably the more nefarious thing to think about.
If I may very briefly, it's not that I have a particularly good answer to your question. I don't know of research suggesting that if I cite the BLS, people automatically believe it. But because institutions like the BLS and the Congressional Budget Office are on my mind a lot, probably not true in this room, but in general, these institutions are just vastly underappreciated. And one thing that we really ought to be doing is thinking as hard as we can and working hard to shore up the credibility and the reputations of these institutions. These really are among the best, most neutral institutions that we have. They'll deliver bad news to both parties, and they do a lot of the time. I think if we're going to be fighting misinformation, it's not going to be a wholesale solution. But one thing we've got to do is to protect these fantastic institutions.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the other side of the room here.
Thank you. It's for a very interesting panel. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask about allegations of weaponized fact checkers, where politicians have alleged that certain sites will effectively dog their claims in an attempt to discredit them under the guise of fact checking or being an unbiased observer. Is there a way to prevent, and of course this connects to what you're saying previously about traditional organizations being undermined for partisan reasons. Talk a little bit about that and how you can counter those kind of claims.
I have a lot of thoughts from my own research on weaponizing fact checks, but before that, Lori?
So, you know what, we do get, we get complaints from both sides on our coverage, and, you know, I think the best thing we can do is, you know, tell people, well, look at this story we did, or look at this other story we did, and do our best to fact check both sides, but without, you know, EJ talked about a false equivalency. We're not trying to count, you know, oh, we got 5 on the Democrats, let's make sure we have 5 on the Republicans. We have to report as we see things. And, you know, one issue we do a lot of stories on President Trump, and, you know, people will ask us about that. You know, aren't you going to fact check somebody else? We do fact check other people. But he is the President of the United States, and that is our main focus. And he also is very prolific in terms of tweets, and there was campaign speech this week, so we do have a lot more material to look at.
In some of my own research on the impact of fact-checking, particularly for the American Press Institute, we looked at how political organizations appropriate fact checks and use them to club their opponents. And so they would do an ad with ominous music saying, PolitiFact and factcheck.org have found our opponent to be a lying liar. And so that's an interesting form of weaponizing fact checks. What's even more interesting is when the political organizations that use fact checks in that way in their advertising or political messages or in debates will mischaracterize a fact check to use the credibility of a fact checker to beat up on their opponent, which actually happens a shocking amount. So, I'm not quite sure what to do about that other than to call them out on that every time it happens. So 1 or 2 more questions in the middle right here, gentleman with glasses.
Wonderful presentation. My name is Stephen Shore. Barry Goldwater once had the proposal when he expected that John Kennedy would be his opponent of at least doing some joint travel together, and instead of partisan rallies, have the give and take, not unlike the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Do you think a greater number of these joint travel or joint unscripted appearances might help repudiate more outlandish claims that candidates might otherwise be tempted to make?
The Trump-Clinton bus tour would be fun.
I mean, I think the danger would be that it would be the Punch and Judy show, right? But I think maybe not so much in terms of misinformation, but EJ talked earlier about Walter Lippmann, but as a counter to the Walter Lippmann notion of falsification and verification, we might throw in a lot of John Dewey there as well, which is to say that modeling something like conversation aiming toward shared purpose, we need a lot more of that. And if that is what you have in mind, I think that could very much help repair some of the damage that is done by the Punch and Judy show.
Yeah, I'd say we often find, you know, we'll have a politician's office contact us and say, hey, why don't you guys look at this ad or look at this claim that my opponent's making? And sometimes they'll provide, you know, valuable information to help in the fact check. But a lot of times, a politician's fact check of another politician doesn't really get to the claim. It's kind of countering that claim with other claims. So it's not always beneficial to have politicians fact check one another.
I would love to see that sort of activity. Whether it would have an effect, I'm really not sure. What I wonder about even more is just how to get from here to there. The change in norms, I'm thinking of the US Congress specifically, the change in norms in the last 25 years in the US Congress has just been astonishing. You used to have, of course, as you know, much more of this activity 30, 40 years ago. Whether we can get that level of bipartisan communal activity together again, I simply don't know.
And one last question, sort of towards the aisle in the middle here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lisa Rosenberg with Open the Government. I wanted to follow up on your proposal, which I like, sort of the 3 strikes you're out if Kellyanne Conway or somebody is on the news. How does that approach apply to White House press briefings or covering the president's Twitter feed? I mean, it sounds like a joke question, but I'm serious. There's a point where there's so much misinformation or disinformation being plied by, the top. How do you not cover it?
Well, you have to change institutional norms. There's a journalism professor at NYU, Jay Rosen, who had a hashtag send the interns for the White House press briefing because no new information was being given out at those. So why you turn that into a spectacle that you pretend is going to have news value is a question I don't know. I mean, the answer would be is that it generates news cycles, right? And that's what CNN and the big media right now is making money hand over fist covering the lies, right? And that's the incentive. If you look at the ratings over when Trump was candidate and look at the ratings since, they love this because it's outrage generation. Kelly Conway comes on, says something crazy, and then you have your opinion people say, she said something crazy, and then repeat. And you don't need writers, you just invite the same people on and you sell advertising for it. And you have to change the institutional norms, and our institutional norms are that you cover the White House briefing, you have the president's advisor on. And I think journalists need to rethink that because the institutional norms are being used against them right now.
All right. Any other answers on that question? So I'm going to wrap this up a little bit with we've talked about 3 strikes you're out. We've talked about sort of joint appearances as possibilities. One of the most interesting things I've learned in the past few years of looking into the whole fact-checking universe comes from our colleagues at Full Fact in the UK, which is sort of the factcheck.org of the UK. And they were telling us about a rule in Parliament that if you are caught saying something inaccurate in Parliament, that you have to go and correct the record. And so one of the things Full Fact does is it's doing its fact-checking work, will often report those falsehoods in a way that then requires members of Parliament to respond. And I keep wondering what would happen if the House or Senate passed such a rule, since they can pass their own rules, what effect that might have. But I really want to thank our panel here. So Lori, Matt, John, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. We're going to pause for a moment to make room for the spread of misinformation discussion, which is coming up next. So thanks.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.